Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenneth Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel today, which is entitled Climate Change and the Arctic, Policy Channels. I would just say a word about the Dickey Center. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary and have just moved into this wonderful new building just a couple of months ago. In the Dickey Center, our job, very simply put, is to promote international understanding, and in a more concrete fashion, that means to ensure that the students, the faculty, the community here at Dartmouth have a very good understanding of the major global issues of the day, and perhaps even more importantly, a commitment to do something about them. And one of the constituent parts of the Dickey Center is our Institute for Arctic Studies, whose director is Professor Ross Virginia. And Ross, please stand if you would. Yeah. Ross is not only the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies, but he's also been one of the two key organizers and planners for this meeting, so he's a very special person in a lot of ways. But the fact that the Dickey Center, has the Institute of Arctic Studies, under its purview, and also the fact that Dartmouth has a very long history of involvement in Northern and Arctic studies, going back to President John Sloan Dickey, for whom our center is named, and also because of the many-year presence here of the famous Arctic explorer Wilhelm R. Stephenson. We are very much focused, on issues of the Arctic and climate change. So it's a wonderful experience, to have ASSW here. And our panel today, as I said, is focused on the various issues attendant to climate change in the North. Just a little bit before I introduce today's speakers, and I'm really grateful to all of them, some of whom have traveled a great distance to get here. My career before coming to Dartmouth was as a United States diplomat, and I had the honor to serve as a U.S. ambassador as well 2 times. And that experience taught me the difficulty at times of getting policymakers to focus on, to pay attention to gathering problems before they became very serious. The only effective means at times of getting their attention was to claim a threat to national security. Global warming is no longer in any doubt, and its threat is real. With it comes a series of policy issues that will require intensive study, extensive dialogue, deliberation, and soon, decisions involving governments, the academy, and Native peoples. The organizers of this Arctic Science Summit Week and myself view this panel as a step in the direction of establishing that necessary dialogue and agenda to help mitigate the impact of these problems before it is too late. To date, Arctic issues have been dealt with by policymakers primarily as a subsidiary matter, and decisions affecting the region are made by concerned states on issue-specific arrangements rather than in a single, comprehensive, and integrated regional organization. The Arctic itself, with few exceptions, has not been the focal point of high-level discussion, and government officials working these issues must compete to get policy-level attention for them. How then are we going to present to policymakers a clear and compelling case to focus on climate change-related issues now in a reasoned way before military, security, and commercial considerations raise tensions and possibly produce conflict? Even worse is the risk that governments could respond in a knee-jerk ad hoc fashion, which could exacerbate problems and increase pressures on Native peoples. The issues surrounding climate change are well documented, pressing, and require concerted multilateral responses from scientists, Native communities, and policymakers alike. These attendant issues include the melting of sea ice and the resultant opening of northern sea routes, prompting opportunities and challenges for commerce, shipping, and security, competition for and exploitation of mineral and energy resources, rapid dislocating cultural and social change for the Inuit communities of the Arctic, interactions between Native peoples and Western scientific and political communities, new environmental and health problems, and questions about the capability and authority of existing Arctic international forums to manage these problems. Given both the opportunities and challenges Arctic climate change poses, the big question facing us today is whether the tensions created in addressing these can be managed through dialogue and negotiation. If one ascribes to a realpolitik view of state behavior, you might be pessimistic. The Arctic is too rich a location not to inspire competition and pursuit of selfish national interest. If, however, one puts faith in multilateralism, collective security, and the pursuit of the common good, you might have reason to hope that a positive outcome is possible. Yet, are the structures, institutions, and procedures already in place adequate to mediate such potential conflicts? And what can the Academy and Native peoples offer policymakers to deal with these issues? There already exist a number of deliberative bodies for the Arctic, including the Arctic Council, the Northern Forum, and the IASC, that are very important, useful, and productive in framing and discussing issues and developing action plans pertaining to the environment, sustainable development, etc. They are not, however, regulatory in nature or endowed with authority to make binding decisions on significant issues. Are these institutions able to meet the new challenges? And if not, what will fill the void? We will likely not come up with definitive answers today, but I'm sure this panel of experts will shed considerable light on these issues and possible approaches. The Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth and its Institute for Arctic Studies are committed to facilitating this type of interdisciplinary dialogue, and we have already done one and plan to hold in the near future a series of conferences during the IPY between policymakers, the Academy, and representatives of Native peoples to focus more attention on these important policy issues. Now, our panel today, and we are unfortunately still missing one of the members, Franklin Griffiths, whom I hope will still be able to be here today. But I've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes. And with our schedule, that should leave us about 45 minutes or so for questions afterward, which will give us, a lot of time. So what I'm going to do now is to introduce all of the panelists. And Franklin, who was going to speak first, when he comes, I will fit him in. But I'm going to now describe each of the five panelists and in the order in which they will speak. Franklin Griffiths is one of Canada's leading experts on Arctic and Russian affairs. Until recently, he was a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. There he held the George Ignatieff Chair of Peace and Conflict Studies. Professor Griffiths contributed, along with others, to the formation of the Arctic Council, co-chairing the Arctic Council panel, which persuaded the government of Canada to commit formally to the idea of a central Arctic intergovernmental forum with direct Aboriginal participation. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto and his doctoral degree from Columbia University in New York. He's had numerous publications, in good part dealing with his expertise in Soviet politics. And his most recent publication, about 4 years ago, deals with global warming and the politics of Canadian sovereignty over the Northwest Passage. Now retired from the University of Toronto, Professor Griffiths is at work on a book on civility in world politics. Very interesting subject. Perhaps an oxymoron, but nonetheless. He also consults on Canadian and circumpolar Arctic affairs and on international security matters, with particular reference to Russian weapons-grade plutonium and the management of Canada's nuclear fuel waste. Our second speaker, Mr. Mead Treadwell, is chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. He was appointed to the commission in 2001 and was designated chair by the president in 2006. During his 30 years of residency in Alaska, Mead Treadwell has played an active role in Arctic research and exploration. His focus has been on development of natural resources, protection of the Arctic environment, and fostering international cooperation after the end of the Cold War. In business, government, and the academy, Mead Treadwell has helped establish a range of research programs in technology, ecology, social science, and policy. Currently, he serves as Senior Fellow of the Institute of the North, founded by former Alaska Governor Hickel. And his research at the Institute focuses on strategic and defense issues facing Alaska and Arctic regions, management of Alaska's commonly owned resources, and integration of Arctic transport and telecommunications infrastructure. He's also in business. He's chairman and CEO of Venture Ads Astra, an Anchorage, Alaska-based firm which invests in and develops new geospatial and imaging technologies. He's also had a rich history of service in Alaska state government, in the Department of Environmental Conservation. He's won numerous awards and has numerous publications. Suffice it to say, he's done very, very well. Our third panelist is Minnie Gray. Minnie has worked actively throughout her career to improve the quality of life in northern Canada. Born in Kangersuk, Nunavik, she served as third vice president of the Makavik Corporation, the official organization representing the Inuit of Nunavik, where she focused on self-government and community and economic development. After leaving Makavik, Ms. Gray became vice president of the Canada office of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference for 6 years. She also chaired the Nunavik Education Task Force from 1991 to 2000. She was the executive director for the Ungava Hospital and chairperson of the Nunavik Nutrition and Health Committee. She sits on the board of Nasivik, a Center for Inuit Health and Changing Environment. She's a board member of the Canadian Council of Learning and is a member of the UN Advisory Group to the Inuit Circumpolar Conference. She is also a member of the Technical Advisory Panel on Aboriginal Research for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And since 2002, she is chief negotiator for a Nunavik self-government. The fourth speaker, Dr. David Hick, is executive director of the Canadian International Polar Year Secretariat. He is also Professor and Canada Research Chair in Northern Ecology in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta. He has conducted research in northern Canada since 1984. His interests are focused on the ecology of tundra ecosystems, particularly interactions between plants and animals in a rapidly warming climate. His PhD is from the University of British Columbia. As Executive Director of the Canadian IPY Secretariat, Dr. Hick is responsible for coordinating the Canadian IPY program and providing liaison between Canadian activities and the International Program Office in Cambridge, the UK. He has a particular interest in ensuring that early career scientists, students, and youth have opportunities to participate in IPY activities. And in 2002, Dr. Hick was awarded the Patricia Roberts Pichette Award by Environment Canada for his commitment to advancing the goals of the Ecological Monitoring and Assessment Network in Canada. And our final speaker, Jeff Miotke, is a Foreign Service officer currently serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the U.S. State Department for Science, Space, and Health. Previously, he served as the Chief of Staff for the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky. Also, he served as Director of the Office of Global Change in the bureau that we call OES, where he was a senior negotiator on climate change. Overseas, he has served in Lesotho, Hungary, Guatemala, and in the Dominican Republic. He has received 11 honor awards, as well as the Frank Loy Award for Environmental Diplomacy. And last but not least, he holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Dartmouth College in 1979. So let me ask Mead to begin, and then Minnie and David and Jeff, and hopefully Franklin will come. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and welcome and happy new International Polar Year to all of you here. As chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, I joined 7 other commissioners in the task of helping to convince a nation that the $400 million a year we spend on research in the Arctic, using over $1 billion worth of research infrastructure, is valuable to the fate of the nation and the world. Part of our effort to convince people will be our release tomorrow of the goals report that the Commission has prepared over the last 2 years on goals and objectives for Arctic research and to amend the 5-year U.S. Arctic Research Plan. Now, the idea of convincing people that Arctic research is important is not a tough sell here at Arctic Science Summit Week. But to find support for research, we often have to remind policymakers and the public of the value and relevance of Alaska and the Arctic itself. Now, that's been the same old story really even since the purchase of Alaska in 1867, which made America an Arctic nation. Secretary of State Seward had to weather charges that he was buying a sucked orange, an icebox, Seward's Folly, and I guess my favorite was Walrussia. But we thought we were relevant then, and I guess we believe we're relevant now. In my remarks today, I'd like to highlight 5 policy initiatives we at the Commission are urging or helping the United States take on in Arctic policy. All of them are in the context of a newly accessible Arctic, accessible with globalization, accessible with open borders since the end of the Cold War, and last but not least, accessible physically now with climate change. All of these policy initiatives advance us toward the goal of a connected Arctic and maintaining U.S. competitiveness. These 5 initiatives are somewhat restricted to our Commission's purview of advising on science, but we'll get into some of the post-climate change policy issues in a moment. But the 5 initiatives are, number 1, expanding the boundaries of the United States under Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Treaty. Number 2, maintaining our national icebreaker capacity, including making a $1 billion+ commitment to replace the polar-class icebreakers Polar Star and Polar Sea. Number 3, developing a national plan to fit into an international plan to advance safe shipping in the Arctic. Number 4, continuing international cooperation in the Arctic and giving it the financial means and studying policy instruments to strengthen it, as Ambassador Yalowitz suggested. Number 5 is completing the International Polar Year with a legacy of integrated science, including a robust and growing Arctic observing network. Now, each of these policy initiatives, I believe, are straightforward, but we enter the discussion with full knowledge that we may not get there directly. J.P. Morgan once said that a man does something for the right reason and the real reason. Now, I may need to see what's in that hardware store window across the street, but the real reason why I walk across the street is to smile at the pretty girl standing there. And when it comes to policy about Alaska and the Arctic, we've seen nations behave that way before also. Energy policy and security policy have a way of trumping everything else. Early in my career, I was an officer of a company that worked closely with the United States, U.S., and Japanese diplomats to establish an energy working group. Our firm was trying to expand Alaska's liquefied natural gas sales to Japan and add Korea and Taiwan. We were preparing to build a gas pipeline out of the Arctic. Now, there were many right reasons for doing this, and the Reagan administration at the time talked about balancing trade, energy security, common investments in infrastructure, and the like. But I found out later that the president had one more thing in mind, and perhaps that was the reason that an Alaska natural gas pipeline was in a 3x5 card in his pocket every time he sat down with Prime Minister Nakasone. It turns out that oil, gas, guns, and gold were the commodities keeping the Soviet Union in business. Japan was moving to buy Russia's Sakhalin gas, just as Europe was likely to buy Russian Arctic gas. And our project was a proxy for the real policy objective to help bring down the Soviet Union by cutting back their cash flow. Now, likewise, once the Soviet Union fell, we've seen a bipartisan U.S. policy to help Russia stabilize its democracy with oil production revenues, perhaps the opposite of what Reagan's policy was. I like to call it a drain Russia first policy for the Arctic, one that may have had side effects in the massive Comey oil spill in 1994, and one that will increase oil shipping in ice-covered waters dramatically over the next decade. Now, today, as Russia's power in the energy marketplace has given the U.S. and others cause to take a second look, and among other things, our nation is encouraging oil transport routes in the Caspian region that do not cross Russian territory. I tell that story kind of as the right reason, the real reason. I believe the U.S. will do the right things in the Arctic, but the ultimate drivers for each of these policies are yet to be seen. I repeat, any Arctic policy on research and environment is likely to be related to energy policy, security policy, trade, and economics. The connection between climate change and energy policy is being made today in lots of places. The $3 billion annual U.S. Climate Change Technology Program is a very good example. In the Arctic, I think the search for secure supplies of energy and alternative supplies of energy will both remain drivers. Now let me get back to specifics on these 5 points. Number 1, on expanding the territory of the United States. The U.S. has not ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty for many reasons, but the President's budget this year has $8 million in it to go ahead to continue the mapping effort to make a claim under Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Treaty. And that follows up on several cruises of the icebreaker Healy already, with work being led by Professor Larry Mayer at the University of New Hampshire. Our argument is that we should be preparing now to make a claim for the time that the United States ratifies, and also we should be prepared to judge the claims of others. Now, this might remind you of the rationale many nations used to establish research in Antarctica before the Antarctic Treaty. With Law of the Sea, doing the research gets us, and ratification gets us a place at the table. Now, from the Commission's standpoint, both a right and a real reason we support this is that the mapping cruises also provide platforms for additional Arctic Ocean research. For the United States, it's significant as we look offshore for energy and seek to diversify our resources that the extended continental shelf exercise can add territory to the U.S. greater in area than 2 Californias. A second Arctic policy objective the U.S. must grapple with is its icebreaker fleet. Whenever this subject comes up, the Canadian press suggests our purpose is to enforce our claims for freedom of navigation through the Northwest Passage, an archipelago they claim is in turtle waters. Now, I don't think the real reason we need icebreakers is to press that point with Canada, and neither, I'm told, does the U.S. Coast Guard, which has a very strong level of cooperation with their Canadian counterparts, including joint voyages, shared responsibility on Arctic search and rescue, and sharing information on ice conditions and ship design. We support these icebreakers as a vital research platform, but the United States has many other responsibilities with its Arctic, including the coastal protection activities it does on the rest of its coastline, from border enforcement, fisheries management, oil spill response, placing aids to navigation, and again, search and rescue. Perhaps like Russia, these ships will perform an escort role for commercial shipping. When it comes to shipping, some say the real reason the U.S. is talking about shipping is we want global warming. I reject that, but it is fun to read it in the blogs. I usually don't find myself part of conspiracy theories. But I argue that moving forward with the U.S. policy on shipping is both a precautionary as well as a strategic approach. Under the law of the sea, two new elements are introduced to the shipping picture in the Arctic Ocean. First is Article 76, already discussed. Second is Article 234 regarding ice-covered areas, which allows a coastal nation to implement special environmental rules on shipping in these areas. Between these two rules, we could be in for a virtual train wreck regarding access in the Arctic Ocean. Many overlapping jurisdictions give, frankly, the capability for one nation or another to put regulations in place that could result in a troll under the bridge type rent-taking. Now, wouldn't it be better to look at something like our St. Lawrence Seaway Agreement with Canada and offer the world's shipping community a safe, secure route with the appropriate precautions in place? That's one byproduct we hope for from the Arctic Council's current Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, and it may be that we enhance safe shipping in the Arctic with joint agreements on aids to navigation, search and rescue, ice-breaking escort, etc. The fourth policy I mentioned is that we follow closely is the health of our mechanisms of Arctic cooperation to begin with. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a remarkable record in the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, the follow-on Arctic Council, and the Association of Regional Governments, the Northern Forum. The indigenous groups supported through the Indigenous Peoples Secretariat are also a hallmark of all of this regional cooperation. Dr. Orrin Young, while here at Dartmouth, has written much about this. What can make these methods stronger, and do they need to be stronger? One of the toughest challenges in recent years has been the question of action in these groups on climate change. Some nations have hoped that the Arctic venue be a place where the U.S. might make some commitments on climate, given the many changes we're witnessing in the Arctic. And others have said these are not appropriate forums and that, quote, the Arctic tail should not wag the global dog. Now, on some kind of dogs, the tail is a pointer. These Arctic cooperation mechanisms have served that purpose. And I believe the stronger they are, the stronger they can be to help us with several appropriate policy responses to climate change. The first and one where we've been effective is warning. The Arctic Climate Impact Assessment was really the first comprehensive Arctic view to tell people what was going on. The follow-on State of the Arctic report done by NOAA and further follow-on to the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment due in 2010 will be important aspects of this. A second aspect of climate change response is adaptation. And when you come to adaptation, it means looking at everything from the effects of climate change on the people who live there to the effects of climate change on the world at large. And again, efforts such as the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment and so forth are pretty good outcomes of that policy cooperation effort. The third effort is mitigation. And that's where I think we've found ourselves stopped up, saying we're not going to move forward through that forum in that area. And I can say this only, the more science we do and the more research we do in the Arctic area, the more understanding we're going to have of specific Arctic-related mitigation aspects that might be taken on. Some of those might be taken on in the energy area. Some of them may be taken on in response to or in providing science to carbon registries and other regimes. And while I don't expect the United States to change its position that says this is not the appropriate forum to take on major climate change response issues with only 8 nations at the table. I do believe that the methods of communication here are important and will continue to be very important as we respond to climate change. Finally, let me talk about a policy we've already adopted and now have to make true. The ministerial documents from the Arctic Council this fall committed 8 nations to an Arctic observing network. The blueprint for AON was laid out by an Academy study last spring. The opportunities for international cooperation in this and leaving the Arctic wired for sound as a legacy of the International Polar Year is great. Now, as one who goes to bat with my fellow commissioners for science budgets in Washington, let me tell you what I'm looking for right now with AON is a plan with specifics. And this is a challenge really to the science community. Many different agencies, the state of Alaska, private academic institutions, and many nations collect data in the North. No agency can take this monitoring effort on alone. An Arctic Observing Network plan tied to the global goal of the GEOS, the Global Earth Observation System of Systems, is doable. And by doing the planning work, an effective Arctic Observing Network is achievable. And I'll just leave it at this. As nations consider policy options in response to climate change, and those include things like the U.S. current climate change technology program, a $3 billion a year commitment to get us off, to reduce the U.S. Greenhouse gas footprint, to cap and trade schemes, to tax schemes that are being discussed by several states, both in New England and the West, to large geoengineering schemes. Every single one of these schemes really requires us to have very good, strong, solid earth science to trace the feedback effects, both of what is happening now in the climate and what is likely to come on. And so from the Arctic policy standpoint, I just can't say how important an Arctic Observing Network is to be able to help calibrate any of these policy schemes that nations are considering at the present time. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Nakop me haram mong ilaw nas ni hayun nakatsi. Tuki mo si millo. Didn't you bring my interpreter, Marianne?
I'm glad to be here today. That's what you said.
Yes. Yes, just to thank everyone, the organizers. Closer? Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here. It's great to see so many people having interest in the Arctic. I was away on vacation, and apparently nobody could fill this seat. So I had to go back to the office early and decide whether I should be here or not. And since they were so accommodating, and here I am. It's great to be here. And I am from the Arctic. Actually, I am from a region called Nunavik, which is the area situated in Quebec above the 55th parallel. I brought little pamphlets here that show where my region is, and they're over there at that front table for those of you that may be interested afterwards. I didn't want to have to talk about where I'm from, so you can learn that yourself. Nunavik is, like I said, situated above the 55th parallel. It is 1/3 of the province and has 14 Inuit communities along the coastline. My region is considered the southern Arctic, really. Whenever there's a Canadian Northern strategy or policies being put in place, it's usually left out because it's under the 60th parallel. We have a population of about 10,000 people, and we speak 3 languages, Inuktitut being our mother tongue, English and French being the other 2. I'm here to really put a face on the Arctic. I am from there. I was born there. I was raised there. I grew up watching the North change, my environment change. I grew up watching our lifestyle change. I grew up traveling the tundra on the dock team, and I now live in Montreal, although I am still practicing my traditions whenever I return north. What can I really here I am talking about the Arctic and the impact it has, the climate change has impact on the Arctic. This is the reason why I'm here, to talk about how climate change is impacting the Arctic. And I asked myself, what can I say that's not already been said? I'm sure many of you know all about the work that the Inuit Circumpolar Conference has done throughout the world, and the world becoming more and more aware of how the North is changing. And I can say that climate change is changing the face of the North, the Arctic, and we see that and observe it on a daily basis. I can talk about the reduction of the ice forcing the polar bear, who is an ice frequenter that lives on the ice and eats off the ice, finds food. And this bear foraging inland to where they do not normally frequent, even in the area of Ngava Bay where there's trees from my area. We're talking about temperatures changing so drastically that previously frozen ice trail melts in December and forces hunters and their families to wade waist deep in slush in December. And we're talking about non-Arctic species of animals arriving in regions which they are not indigenous to. Skunks and moose in my region, robins in the tundra, and the list goes on. The impact of climate change is affecting our ability as people to practice our traditions and livelihood, and it is endangering us, the people. Some say that we are the endangered species. I wouldn't go that far, because I come from a surviving culture. I come from a survivor people. And we've had to survive in one of the harshest environments for thousands of years, and we will continue to do so, because we're also very adaptable. As the climate changes in the Arctic, so does our lifestyle and population. We heard about development. Economic impacts will arise. The economic impact can both be positive and negative. And positive being more jobs for maybe local people, and making economic development easier for undeveloped regions. But it could also be to the detriment of the local population, who has less means to take on entrepreneurship, as opposed to the steady stream of people from outside that could come to take advantage of the new warmer North. More development, adding to the changing of the environment that we depend on so much for our food, our clothing, and a way of life that is part of our well-being. My region, Nunavik, has long been involved in policy development since the creation of certain institutions under the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. This agreement, signed in 1975, was the first modern-day comprehensive land claims agreement between the Inuit, Cree, the federal government, provincial government, and development corporations. We are continuing to develop and make policies in areas of education, health, research, as well as municipal issues. But we need to be involved more beyond these issues. In order for policies to be effective in our region, in our homeland, the main governments have to be collaborators. We heard about dialogue. Policies have to reflect realities of our regions. I believe that our people, my people, have lived with far too many policies that have been without the input of those that are being impacted. And climate change has impacted us and is continuing to impact us. We've had to live with colonial policies for far too long to the detriment of the environment, and we are slowly being killed with policies that are not helping us. Handouts which promote helplessness and dependency are just examples. We were capable of governing ourselves, but through the changes that have come upon us in our social structures, there are more and more social problems that we're not able to handle. What we're saying is, let's create policies together which don't extinguish our identity. I named my short talk here Hanutaga, which is an Inuktitut word which would translate basically what to do now. But really in Inuktitut, it's asking, how now? I ask this question because we all know that the climate has changed. But can we change to save our environment? I know that my people have made drastic changes in their lives in the last 50 years. I have lived the last 50 years seeing it. Changes so drastic that have had very negative impacts on the social fabric of our life. And although we are very adaptable, it's becoming harder and harder to be adaptable and always changing without having any input to the policies. I don't think we need to further destroy that fabric of life. Hanutaga, I ask that. Hanutaga. We cannot reverse back. We're now computerized, motorized. Our dog teams have long been taken from us. So I ask Hanutaga, how can we help in developing policies to maintain identity and a way of life? But at the same time, we want to contribute to the benefit of the global world. We want to contribute in a positive way. And I think, listen to us, the people that are from the Arctic, that live the life, that witness this global warming, climate change. We're telling you that something is not right. Let us start by doing small steps, and these small steps will add up. I can use examples of major cities in the non-Arctic regions. They take steps to make more green space. We don't even have recycling programs in the Arctic. There's a lot of waste in the Arctic. Industrial waste, burning of garbage, abandoned mine sites. I mean, how are we going to deal with that? Just because the Arctic is vast doesn't mean it can accommodate all that, because it will help damage the environment. We have to do something about it. Little steps, baby steps. And you know, in 10 years' time, I would be curious. I would want to see and measure what these small steps have accomplished. I mean, babies start to walk by taking baby steps. And, you know, it's not easy along the way, but they become adults, and hopefully successful adults that will care about the environment. We have to start somewhere, and sometimes, but I believe now is the time. Our contribution, I think, can be in the knowledge that we have never contributed to the destruction of our environment. But we see its destruction the most in what we see today. Our people have used the environment to survive, building shelters with snow in the winter, building tents with animal skins. We made the kayak. The dog team was our transportation. Animal bones and stones were our tools. Fur, our clothing. We waste nothing from we take from the environment. On the other hand, as I said, we're in a dilemma. We can't reverse back. We want to be contributors to policy making and to the betterment of the world. So we're becoming modern, but we would like to use our ancestral wisdom and traditional knowledge to contribute to wise policy making. I think we have a lot to offer. In my region, as I was introduced as the chief negotiator for Nunavik self-government. I have been on this project for the last 4 years, and I believe in negotiating with the Canadian government and the Quebec government for the eventual creation of a Nunavik government. I think we're on the right track. I believe that it is the right step in the right direction because it ensures our participation in policy making through a meaningful dialogue with other government officials. I think this way we can be a part of the solution and not the problem. Mead.
Well, thank you. That is always difficult to follow such a clear enunciation of the reasons why we're all involved in this. My position as in the IPY Secretariat in Canada puts me outside of government, and for a long time as an observer of policy, and now I think with an opportunity for the IPY program to influence that policy, we need to find ways that will have a lasting impact. In Canada, a comprehensive, detailed, and coherent policy framework that unites the domestic and foreign policy relevant to the North is required to guide the federal actions and decisions. And although there are pieces of that policy in place, I think it could best be described as a bit of a vacuum at the national level. 20 years ago, there was a Northern political and economic framework, but it really needs to be updated in the context of evolving geopolitical and economic and social and environmental factors that are influencing the northern regions. And I think in terms of climate change, we've treated this in the past as an environmental issue, but it really is a whole of society issue. And our ability to treat it that way is still something we're grappling with. I think it was Wally Broker said the climate system is an angry beast and we're poking it with sticks. And I think what follows from that is that we've now taken those sticks and we're beating each other over the head when it comes to policy. We're not really working together yet. And we need to find opportunities to do that. And as I'll come to in a moment, I think the International Polar Year likely provides the best opportunity we've had in a generation, certainly in my generation. Now, any new northern policy in Canada will certainly reflect the interests that Mead discussed, those are all relevant to Canada, but I think they're much more strongly influenced by the land claims and political devolution of responsibility to people in the North, as Minnie just discussed. So the human dimensions of whatever foreign policy Canada develops will be paramount, and these will reflect devolution and management of resources and land claims and self-government agreements, as well as health and infrastructure, sovereignty and security, and this will include a marine policy, both domestic and international. I think we're all working together on these types of things. The bilateral and multilateral relationships that Canada has are going to be very important, and how we strengthen those will need to be reflected. And adaptation to climate change, and how we use knowledge and research and education to address those goals will be very important. Now, some of these things were addressed in a 2004 Northern Strategy framework that engaged the territories and the federal government, and to a lesser extent the Aboriginal organizations and provinces to look at these issues. And there were 7 elements to that, and the 7th one was to enhance science and research. Now, although this comprehensive strategy was never adopted, at the time, the Northern Science and Technology element of the Northern Strategy was described fairly famously by a deputy minister as the one ring that binds them all. And this found life as the International Polar Year, even though all these other issues turned out to be problematic and weren't dealt with in a systematic way. So as an outcome of that, the Government of Canada committed $150 million of new funding to support the Canadian IPY program, in addition to other types of resources that were already being committed, and focused on 2 areas. One was climate change impacts and adaptation, and the other was the health and well-being of Northerners and Northern communities. So these are really the policy-relevant objectives of what Canada will be doing and trying to accomplish during IPY. And to use that investment to leverage other policy objectives related to climate change, science and technology strategies, and Northern priorities around security and quality of life and economic development. So all of that is fine, but I think many of us wonder, how will we accomplish that? How will we make that connection between an investment in a research program like IPY? And just to put this in context, $150 million over several years is an increment over something around $133 million that the federal government has estimated it invests each year into Northern science and research. Take those numbers loosely, but it's very significant. But how will we make that transition from a series of incremental investments that support our understanding of that region in all of its dimensions and the types of policies that will make a real difference in the long term, and all of that underlaid by rapid climate change. So I think what I'm going to suggest is we treat IPY as a grand experiment itself. In many ways it is. It's an experiment for the Canadian government in managing horizontal, interdepartmental, interagency programs, as I said, within the federal house. We're also trying to manage across sectors. The IPY funds that were provided were made available equally in opportunity to federal government scientists, the academic community, Northern communities, and other groups that were interested in participating. And of course, it's been a real challenge to manage the international partnerships in IPY, given that each country provided its own resources, and these really weren't synchronized in a very coherent way to support the international programs. So, you know, as a field ecologist, if I was designing an experiment, I'd be looking for things like replication, and certainly IPY provides that. I'd be looking for things like randomization, and I couldn't imagine a much more random process than IPY. So how do we use this? How do we keep track of what we've done during IPY and look at the outcomes of that program and use that to feed into the policy machine, so we come away with some sort of recording of what the best opportunities and the best outcomes might be? And I'd suggest that that's an experiment we would like to conduct in real time and not 10 years from now or down the track. So, and again, I don't think we'll have an opportunity like this again. And so if we'd like research and knowledge to influence policy, then how do we harness our efforts right now to learn what works, what doesn't work, and what we should do after IPY has wrapped up? So considerable time and energy has been expended in establishing institutions in Canada and internationally in other countries to address polar issues. And IPY can be a test of how well those institutions work and how that knowledge can be incorporated into policy in a timely fashion. And I'd suggest that rather than reinventing the wheel, we really want to ask, how can these institutions be more effective? And so the science community will have to be very creative in finding ways to make this information more accessible and in a timely way. It's clear in Canada that political leadership is essential for IPY to be successful, and for the continuity of northern research programs and in addressing climate change. So IPY is that catalyst. I think that leadership can come at any point. Ideally, we'd like to engage leaders in those discussions from the very beginning. But there are other organizations. In Canada, we have a Canadian Polar Commission that IPY is going to, I think, herald a call for its renewal and strengthening of the leadership that we need at the national level. Perhaps we need something like a domestic Arctic Council to bring together federal, territorial, provincial, Arctic Indigenous peoples and others to discuss how we can deal with these issues more effectively. We don't have something like that in Canada, but we created it as a mechanism to plan for IPY. So we've done this through the back door. We've done it from the ground up. It's not anchored in any sort of policy, but there are organizations, and there are certainly many people who have been involved in IPY to secure that. And whatever Arctic policy we have, I think, must address the northern needs and the national interests. And this will be a continuously evolving project that will perhaps take many years to develop and implement, but we have the opportunity to start that process now, or at least to pick up the pieces that already exist. And above all, I think parties should continue to work in partnership to highlight and explore the northern issues and the options for dealing with them. So IPY can be a catalyst for those discussions. So what do I suggest? Well, I think as a community, we can adopt a formal experimental design that needs some sort of leadership, but we need to assess the effectiveness and relevance of this investment in IPY. This can be done at a national level, and it can be done at an international level. And I know there are discussions ongoing about how this might be accomplished, but we need to be serious about it, because I think, again, doing this 2 years down the track won't be nearly as effective as undertaking that right now. Some of this, of course, has started, as you know. The ICARP 2 process is the leading wedge. We need to find a way to make sure that is supported. But that international effort, as you mentioned at the beginning, will not have the same weight as a national effort that's anchored in a formal policy. So in Canada, the IPY has attracted tremendous amount of attention. It continues, I think, as we're only 2 weeks into this, but as we roll forward into a field season, an Arctic field season, people in the north, people in southern Canada and around the world will start to hear more about the specific types of activities. Somehow that then needs to be assessed on an ongoing basis and translated into the types of policies that will support northern development and particularly the challenge of dealing with climate change. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that my wife is very glad that I'm here. Not just because I'm not with her, but because I'm not on the other side of the planet in some place which is a good deal more dangerous, which was a possibility up until the last minute here. Let me say seriously, though, that having served as a climate change negotiator under 3 different presidents, I still think that there's no issue, certainly no environmental issue, but almost no international foreign policy issue that is as complex and as pressing as climate change is. So I'm honored to be part of the Arctic Science Summit Week at its first U.S. venue, and particularly to be among such great company here up at the front desk. My organization, the State Department, is the lead federal agency for international Arctic policy. We coordinate the views of many federal agencies with a stake in the Arctic, and we develop policies that reflect the administration's goals and priorities. In fact, there are quite a large number of federal agencies that have a role in Arctic science and policy. I have a feeling that most of you are well aware of what? Are, are well aware of the roles they play, but let me run through them quickly just in case there are some who aren't. The Department of Interior probably is the largest domestic Arctic portfolio with its many bureaus and services that work in Alaska, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the Minerals Management Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the U.S. Geological Survey, which is one of my favorites. The NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration at Commerce, commits significant scientific research, significant resources to scientific work in the Arctic, both atmospheric and marine research. The Coast Guard within the Department of Homeland Security is responsible for monitoring our Arctic coastline and defending our borders, as well as having a role in enforcing fisheries agreements to which the U.S. is a party. The Environmental Protection Agency has an Alaska office that focuses on environmental concerns in the Arctic, such as persistent organic pollutants and other contaminants that find their way into the Arctic region. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health invest significant resources into human health issues in the Arctic region, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. The Department of Energy has labs in Alaska that work on extractive and renewable energy technologies in cold climates. And the National Science Foundation leads the federal government in funding Arctic scientific research through its Office of Polar Programs. NSF is also the U.S. government lead agency for the International Polar Year. And I think this panoply of agencies is partially why Mead has some frustration getting his issues on the agenda, because there are half dozen agencies at least. And it doesn't even include the White House, the NSC, the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, all the others that have to be brought on board when you're trying to move or change research priorities in the U.S. government. Let me use the rest of my time today, though, to give you a snapshot of some of the work that we in the State Department do with these other agencies in the Arctic. The Arctic Council is the main vehicle through which the U.S. engages internationally on Arctic policy. We are very active in the Council, and we value it as a forum for collaborating with our fellow Arctic states. We are represented at a very high level by my former boss, the Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky. And she has attended all three of the Arctic Council meetings that have taken place during her tenure at the State Department, which reflects how seriously she takes Arctic policy. Because no single country can solve the region's problems, we work within the Council to forge the best regional solutions, including addressing the effects of climate change, which is not to say that we're in favor, for instance, of negotiating an international agreement through the Council, but yet we want to work with the Council to better understand and determine what actions might be taken in the Arctic to mitigate the impacts of climate change. As many of you know, Norway has just taken the rotating chairmanship of the Council, and we look forward to a robust 2 years with a lot of progress on issues of concern to the region and the rest of the world, including the impacts of oil and gas development, integrated oceans management in the Arctic, and the important Arctic marine shipping assessment. Our participation in the Council reflects our national priorities and regional concerns. We take very seriously our stewardship of the Arctic. In fact, my new boss, the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, Environment, and Science, Claudia McMurray, has made the Arctic one of the department's top environmental priorities. Both the executive and legislative branches of our government have significant interest in Arctic affairs. For instance, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska is a member of the Standing Committee of Parliamentarians of the Arctic region, which has observer status at the Arctic Council, and she will be hosting its next meeting in 2008. As we all know, climate change is the overwhelming focus of the scientific community's attention in Arctic, at least the community represented here. Climate policy must be based on sound science. I could get fired for that one. All right. All right. I'll be handing out cash bonuses to people as they leave so they don't say anything about that. The U.S. invests $2 billion a year in a multi-agency research program to investigate natural and human-induced changes in the Earth's global environmental system, to monitor, understand, and predict global change, and to provide a sound scientific basis for national and international decision-making. We have an unequaled commitment to advancing climate change science and technology. Since 2001, the administration has committed nearly $29 billion in strategic research and development initiatives. This year, we will spend almost $4 billion, more than any other country, to advance technologies that are needed to address climate change, including cost-effective alternatives to fossil fuels. The President's 2007 budget calls for an additional $6.5 billion for climate-related activities. President Bush has said that we will act, learn, and act again, adjusting our approaches as science advances and technology evolves. We will continue to adjust our policies to respond as new scientific information becomes available, and we will consider the scientific findings from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other relevant organizations, including the Arctic Council. The Arctic is a complex region that experiences significant natural fluctuations in temperature over time, much so more than the mid-latitudes. However, we are concerned by the impacts that are being felt in the Arctic in particular. We know that the increased use of energy from fossil fuels and other human activities contribute in large part to increases in greenhouse gases and hence to climate change. While the Arctic and Antarctica have historically shown high variability, direct observations of recent climate change are showing effects of climate change in the polar regions. The IPCC's fourth assessment report notes that these changes are dominantly observed in the Arctic, specifically in terms of increases in average temperatures and decreases in sea ice area. Turning to wildlife, the Arctic Council's Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program is expected to give us the most comprehensive picture of the effects of climate change on Arctic wildlife to date. We hope to have the first data and scientific observation on this in the next few years. As you know, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed to list the polar bear as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. If the proposed action is finalized, this will be the first formal recognition by the U.S. government of the effects of climate change on an Arctic species. In addition to the listing activity, the U.S. and Russia concluded a bilateral agreement designed to protect our shared polar bear population. Russia has already ratified the agreement, and the President will soon ratify the agreement for the United States. A joint U.S.-Russia commission then will be established to oversee management of the population. Human health is also an extremely important facet of Arctic policy. Through the Arctic Council's Sustainable Development Working Group, the U.S. is leading the Arctic Human Health Initiative, an IPY project which will study a range of human health issues from infectious and chronic disease surveillance to contaminants in the indigenous traditional food supply, to alcoholism and drug abuse in the Arctic youth and other health concerns, many of which may be influenced by climate change. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is leading this important effort as part of the first ever human dimension of IPY. A key part of the health initiative is the ongoing CDC-led International Circumpolar Surveillance Program. This project addresses prevention and control of emerging infectious diseases in the Arctic. The ICS has been underway since 1999, and all 8 Arctic states participate in it. The U.S. is also participating in sociological studies and projects in the Arctic Council, the most significant being the 2004 Arctic Human Development Report. The development report looked at the human dimensions of sustainable development in the Arctic, and it governs much of the Council's sociological work. An important follow-up to this report is the Survey of Living Conditions in the Arctic, which encompasses the first ever compilation of some 16,000 interviews with Arctic residents on subjects such as education, health, work, leisure, crime, and household economy. The last 2 are separate issues, they're not the same issue. How Arctic residents are adapting to climate change is part of the investigation. The University of Alaska will be sponsoring the first workshop to discuss the survey's findings on March 21st in Anchorage. The survey will be an ongoing study and will provide the most comprehensive information available on life and living conditions in the Arctic. And finally, I'd like to say a few words about national and international security, because as Mead pointed out, we do tend to think of those every once in a while. Although there are no longer Cold War tensions in the Arctic region, the U.S. continues to have basic national security and defense interests there. We have a strong interest in maintaining peace and stability, to control our own borders and areas under our jurisdiction, to carry out military exercises in the region, and to move ships and aircraft freely under the principles of customary international law as reflected in the Law of the Sea Convention. With respect to the commercial shipping, the U.S. is co-leading a major effort in the Arctic Council to estimate future shipping activity and needs in the Arctic Ocean as the ice melts. The Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, AMSA, will use 2004 as a baseline and will extrapolate to 2020 and 2050, while taking into consideration impacts on indigenous people, the environment, and the regional economy. AMSA will be the largest and most comprehensive effort to look at current, futures, and future Arctic shipping, and could stimulate more governmental focus on security issues. We also work cooperatively with Norway and Russia in the Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation Forum, AMIC. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry, with his former Russian and Norwegian colleagues, signed a declaration on September 26, 1996 in Bergen, Norway, calling for cooperation among the parties to jointly address critical environmental concerns in the Arctic. The UK joined in 2003. AMIC undertakes projects such as assisting Russia with spent nuclear fuel containment and remediating radioactive pollution. EPA has a leading role in some of these projects. I expect that the U.S. government will be giving the Arctic region more attention in the future as we deliberate our own evolving environmental, social, economic, and security interests. And thank you again for having me.
Well, Franklin Griffiths, unfortunately, has not arrived. I had asked him to talk about the existing Arctic governance structures, and I'm very happy that each of the speakers, has addressed, in one way or another, that subject. So, as I say, we miss him very much, but I think at least, we've covered what he was going to cover. We have time now for questions, but before we turn to that, I just was wondering if any of the panelists wanted to respond for a moment or two to anything that anyone else said. No. Okay, well then let's open it to questions. And Bill, did you have your hand up, please? Could I just simply ask if you could just stand, because it's just a little hard to hear otherwise.
I'm Bill Roebuck. I'm local at Dartmouth College here. I'd like to ask you, Jerry, about adaptation in the Arctic, and particularly I'm interested in the small villages. I've been in and out of some of the small villages in the region. And what do you see as elements, perhaps people, physical, local government, but mainly at a local level, that might allow one Inuit village to suffer less from change or to adjust easier to change?
Do you really want an answer? I don't know if I can answer that question directly or right to the point, because although we are a very collective, we do things collectively, we're also very, how do you say, in our own region, I talked about our 14 villages, they're all very individual. So it all really depends on who lives there, who is in leadership, and what does the community want to do in order to adapt or to succeed. We're like any other society. It all depends on what is happening in our environment, whether it be social, climate, and so on. And it really takes the community to take the leadership on how to go about going through changes. Some communities can be very on the ball about dealing with situations, and some communities will need to have some assistance from another community and so on. But overall, we've always shared in finding solutions, and I find that particularly in my region, I cannot speak for other smaller communities outside my region, but I think our region is pretty well known for its pioneering in getting together and tackling development issues and so on. So I hope I addressed your question.
There's no question that global warming, climate change is real. There's no question that the overwhelming majority of the impacts are going to be negative. But it seems to me that shipping through the Northwest Passage has the potential for being an unqualified good to come out of global warming, taking place in a milieu of a lot of bad things happening. And given that, I was just wondering what sort of political pressures exist around that issue. I mean, are there people that want to promote it because it might be, to kind of show that, well, Al Gore must be wrong. Here's something wonderful that's going to happen. And just what sort of political pressures there are.
With the unqualified success or unqualified plus, access in the Arctic brings pros as well as cons. There's the noise issue with marine mammals. That's one. There is the pollution issue that is one that we need to be very careful of, especially because we don't have very good techniques to clean up oil and ice if you spill it. So I wouldn't call it necessarily an unqualified plus. On the issue of where is the political force to look at this, I'd have to say, very interestingly enough, our commission, when George Newton was chair, had a meeting in Dutch Harbor, and one of the leading planners, a captain for American President Line, came and said, this Arctic shipping stuff is very interesting to us, but we are still trying to pay off investments around the world in places like Singapore and so forth, so we're not sure we're going to lead with our chin. With the Arctic shipping assessment, our deputy director, Captain Lawson Brigham, has talked to many of the world's shipping companies, and people are now beginning to think about it. But the only companies that have really made substantial investments in ice-capable cargo ships are the Russian, probably Norilsk Nickel, and those who have commodities that have to leave the Arctic that are shipping north and west out, or container shipping in. So there's not yet kind of a backlog, I guess, of people ready to go with this. The argument for looking at shipping that, though, now is to try to avoid this train wreck that I mentioned, where you've got so many different overlapping jurisdictions and new authorities that we've all given ourselves as governments to put on more regulation. And the idea that right now it's basically, even with certain IMO guidelines and certain insurance guidelines, it's basically a situation where activity can happen there with very little search and rescue, very little specific pollution planning, and so very little things in the way of safety that probably should happen in a small pond like that ocean. So there are people with interests, and at the Institute of the North we have a study that will be released shortly. It's actually up on our website now, where we've looked at a shuttle concept where if you it costs $1,500 a container to bring goods from, say, Rotterdam to Yokohama via the Suez Canal. Acre Arctic did an analysis for us, and with a 5,000 container ship, which is a large ship, that's a $500 million investment. But with that ship, you could bring that cost down to, say, $500 to $750 a container soon. And I think that those economics are compelling enough that people will be looking at this with investments in the near future.
Sir? Oh, I'm sorry, Minnie. Please, I'm sorry.
Just to add a little bit to when I talk about the realities that face us, the politics around this whole issue, I mean, it is being discussed. Only just in my region, the high cost of living, milk will cost 3 times more in one of our villages than it does in Montreal. So certainly, I mean, shipping all year round, wow, the positive impacts maybe would lower the high cost of living that we have to endure. But then at the same time, this is the whole point of the discussion, where we have shipping only we get ships in only a couple of times a year, maybe 3 months window. Hence, a lot of the merchandise and the the products that are needed in the north are airshipped the rest of the year, which can be, very, very, very expensive. And then on the other hand, here we are, the modern Inuit that are also trying to survive economically by owning our own airlines. So we are in a dilemma of our own leaders, our own politicians, if global warming it is here, and if the opportunity to go into the waterway shipping, we'll have to look at that. But then what happens to our airlines? So there's these questions.
If I could just follow up for just a moment to ask the two of you, what is going to be the impact in terms of resource exploitation? We've talked about shipping as probably maybe a little bit beyond the horizon yet, but what's going on in terms of exploration as that may be a function of global warming? In other words, is it going to speed up certain resource allocation drives? Are we going to see a new race to develop in the far north because of climate change?
Well, that is the big question going on right now. Definitely whatever will be extracted or developed in the north to be shipped, definitely if the shipping freeway became open, would expedite the shipping and the extraction. But I did mention, not in detail, of what consequences that kind of development will have on the environment and our way of life. Maybe, yes, we will be able to bring in jobs, but within our particular region, we have been fortunate to have the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, which allows us to negotiate with any developer in our region for so many percentages of jobs to go to the locals. And we do have a regime in place where we have environmental studies impact and so on. But these are all, done pre-climate change, I would say. But we have a nickel mine within our region, and they do send in icebreakers to bring back the ore. And certainly, I'm sure they would love to see all that ice melt to make their profits a little bit better.
Well, first off, in the offshore Arctic right now off Alaska, there is two companies. There are two companies, ConocoPhillips and Shell, who have major exploration programs going on this summer. In fact, we'll have a collection of probably 20 ice-strengthened vessels working on seismic and exploration work this summer in that region. I think prior to climate change, there had been one other attempt in this area, and some wells had not proven up, and I'm not sure that climate change is pushing this round or not. I mentioned before Norilsk nickel. I should also mention that there is an effort, a pretty large effort out of Canada's Port of Churchill to also do shipping there. And the Russians announced this week that they are restructuring and putting their icebreakers under an agency to help encourage international shipping. And at the same time, they mentioned their interest in bringing liquefied natural gas from northern Russia to North America from via the Port of Churchill. So there's, those are the kinds of things that we're seeing at this point.
Okay. Questions? Sir.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to attend such a gathering. I'm a resident locally, probably like many, quite interested in trying to develop my own perspective on this whole issue of global warming, the Arctic and the Antarctic, and in fact our whole world. And of course we're being asked to take sides with positions out there, everything from, and I love the term, those who would advocate profound silence, to those who think we probably have gone so far that we may have entered critical mass and are irreversible. So I'm looking for perspective for where I would like to sit, in all of that, whether I should take up the gun or, you know, relax. I just wonder, and I appreciate what all that you are doing in your own ways. I'd just like to know how comfortable you feel about the adequacy of what you are doing, what your organization now is doing, both in your perspective of how serious this all is and the kind of resources you have to deal with with what you're trying to deal with. In other words, how adequate do you feel? And obviously that's relative to your own place on that continuum of concern. I mean, so you know, can I go home happy and feel that we're going to get there okay, or do you feel that there may be, you know, some things that you're simply not being able to address that may very well need to be addressed?
Good question. Who wants to start?
I already asked that question. Hanutaga. I asked that question. Hanutaga. I mean, we are at that point. I believe that the Inuit people from all over the world have been talking about this for many, many years. It's only now, really, in the last 10 years, 5 years, that the rest of the world is starting to listen, or at least hear about these things. I myself, I can speak on behalf of the Inuit organizations that are out there telling the world what is really happening in the Arctic, because if you're not there, you can't really know what is happening. It's through the words of hunters, it's through the observations of people that live there that you can know what is happening. And I think the fact that we're being vocal, at least I can speak about the Canadian and the provincial governments that we work with, that they are there listening to us and willing to talk and have us be a part of the process of finding solutions. Gone are the days of what we call the southern researchers come, and the university researchers is coming to our little villages and saying, oh, we're going to find out how you do this. We're going to research this. It's turned around to the point now where I think we're asking for the research because we want to know what is happening to our environment, to our food. I've been involved in the health sector quite extensively in my region for the last 15 years. And I was chairing a committee which is a catalyst for research and to find out what is happening to our food source. Because not only in the contaminants, because they're in our food chain has been contaminated by various pollutants and so on, but also what is the environment doing with our animals that maybe they're getting sick not from contaminants, but from parasites that never existed, and so on. So I think I can honestly say that our work amongst the Inuit of the world, I think, is progressing well to the point where making the world aware of what is happening. And at least I can say, yes, I'm happy about what we're doing. But I'm here also to say it's not good enough. Let's do more.
It is a very good question. I'll just put a researcher hat on and suggest that the continuity of funding, the types of resources that allow us to commit to things like an Arctic Observing Network require some type of certainty. And often that is difficult to secure at the time that we're setting these programs up. That's fine. But I think many people struggle with the investment in what we know we need as long-term information, those data sets that will allow us to better assess what the rates of change are and what the implications of that change might be, and what type of efforts to put into shorter-term research programs. And I think what we'll learn, perhaps through IPY, is how to address that balance between the types of commitments we need funding agencies and governments to make for long-term monitoring and observation and research programs, and the types of things that we do perhaps more routinely as specific projects. But I think many people in the academic community would, and probably in government as well, and certainly in northern communities would express a frustration with that certainty of commitment to long-term monitoring and research programs.
Jeff, did you want to say? Please.
Yeah. Well, let me just say that I would advise you to buy the gun, as opposed to relax and do nothing, because the science is clear. The climate system is changing. It's changing, excuse me, at an unprecedented rate, and we're already committed to a certain degree of change. So really the question is, what can policy do to affect the amount of change and the speed of the change? That's what we're talking about when we talk about mitigation of climate change. And then in terms of, just speaking for my agency, which is the Foreign Affairs Agency of the United States, I feel that we are doing a good job of reaching out to other countries. We have made it clear that we're not going to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. But frankly, that die was cast even before the protocol was negotiated, when the Senate voted 95-0 to oppose any agreement that excluded the major developing countries, which the protocol does, and which would cause a significant economic cost on the U.S., which the protocol would. So, since the protocol is something that we couldn't sell here in the United States, this administration, I think, frankly, has done a unheralded job of trying to reach out to other countries. And we have, and I'm just going to read off a bunch of them, and I won't go into detail, I promise, on any of them. But we have the Asia-Pacific Partnership, which includes Korea, Japan, India, China, Australia, and the U.S. 8 working groups set up under that, looking at cement, aluminum, buildings and appliance, cleaner fossil energy, coal mining, power generation and transmission, renewable energy and distributed energy, cement and steel. This group of countries accounts for half of the world's population and about half of the economy, about half of all the electricity generated in the world, over half of all the crude steel that's made in the world, over a third of all the aluminum production in the world, 61% of all the cement production, and possesses 58% of all recoverable coal deposits. So that's one partnership. And there are, like I say, there are a slew of other. There's GEOS, the system of systems of global Earth observations. There's there's the International Partnership for a Hydrogen Economy. There's Methane to Markets. There's the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum. Let's see what else. There's the Tropical Forest Act. There's Gen 4, which seeks to produce a new generation of safe nuclear power plants. There's our cooperation in ITER, the International Thermonuclear Energy Reactor. The president has an initiative on illegal logging. So all told, and then we have bilateral and regional partnerships with 15 different countries and groups. And those in total cover 80% of the global emissions of greenhouse gases in the world. So in terms of trying to engage other parties to look for and to develop new technologies which will help lower our emissions in the future, I think this administration is doing a pretty good job. And that's been a large focus of what we in the State Department have been doing under the 2 administrations of George W. Bush.
I was just going to ask a very quick follow-up, if you could, just to pose the question that I posed at the outset about the existing structures. Are they adequate or not? And as we go through this, whether or not, you've described, many, many initiatives and many, many organizations. My question, as you just suggested, get a gun. My question is, are there any organizational structural changes that could be introduced that might not necessitate getting a gun? To anybody, I say, I just throwing that out,
I'm glad you said that. The gun comment irritated me as well. Jeff, I don't disagree with anything you said. I know you didn't mean it. I'm Dave Carlson. I'm the director of the International Program Office for the IPY. But I talk to the public a lot about exactly this issue. And you phrased it beautifully. I think you asked exactly the right question. Where are we in this spectrum from danger to neglect? And where are we in this? The truth is, everything that Jeff said may be working or not working, it doesn't matter. It's not a policy question right now. It's a human population culture question right now. And I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to give you some time scales. Almost everything we know about the polls says that it's about a decade, or it's a couple decades. Ice, we're talking about 10% per decade, so it's a couple decades. Ice sheets, they're a decade to a century. Changes in ocean circulation, decades to a century. How long does CO2 stay in the atmosphere? Decades to a century. And you see where I'm going here. I'm deliberately trying to put this in terms of a generation or a couple of generations. And I'm doing that deliberately because it's the next generation that needs to understand that message. Is it despair or is it possibilities? And do we have things we can do? Think about what else could happen in a generation. It would take us at least a generation, but perhaps not longer than a generation, to rebuild our energy systems, to take action on some of the things that Jeff mentioned. It will probably take a generation, or maybe not longer than a generation, to build an international cooperation, circumarctic, circumglobal, whatever it takes. So I think the question, I don't know the answer to your question, frankly, I don't know. IPY will not answer. But I think what we do know is that from today, we have about a generation or two, maybe not two and maybe only one, to make some of those decisions. And so the real question is, can we wait another generation or two before we make those decisions? And it isn't going to be policies of this country or that country. It's going to be our collective will based on information, understanding, to do that. And what I'm struck by is we have a sort of a skewed generation in this room. And I'm with you in the long end of that generation. When we talk about IPY with enthusiasm, when we talk about climate change with seriousness or alarm, we have to be concerned about the message we're giving to the next generation, because it's going to be their generation, better or worse, that's going to have to deal with this. And I think that message has to be serious today, and maybe in a generation or two, and I don't know. So it's going to move into the dangerous, and that's what IPCC really says. Well. And so, whether you go home and take action on energy or take action on weapons or take action on anything, it's our generation and about a generation when we have to answer these questions. And I think that's the message we have to give to the next generation who are going to have to deal with energy and natural resources and political cooperation, etc. So it isn't going to happen tomorrow. That's my first message. So the gun won't help you because it isn't going to happen tomorrow. But it is going to happen in the next generation, or we're going to have to answer it in the next generation. Thank you.
Mead, did you want to say something?
Dave, I think, put it very well. There's just a couple things. First off, I've heard American policymakers come before our commission and say, with the technology plan that we have, we will make Kyoto-style targets in 50 years. Now, if those Kyoto-style targets were the appropriate targets, and they don't need to be harsher, and that's one of the questions I think Dave is referring to, that approach may get us there. We hear others stand up, some of them have won Oscars lately, who say that we really should be taxing ourselves much more now, that we should be putting on a cap and trade system. And my own personal view, this is not the commission's or the government's, is that I think almost anything we could accomplish with all those may well be negated by other natural forces that are in play. I'm not saying don't do them, but I'm saying have a very, very good accounting system, which is one of the reasons why I want to see this observing network in place. Because, you know, for all that you do to, you know, for all that Governor Schwarzenegger may be able to accomplish with cars in California, a few Arctic lakes may be burping methane that would just take it all away. And I'm not saying that that doesn't mean don't do California. It means have a decent accounting system so nobody's fooling themselves. Okay, and that's a very important scientific objective that we're pushing for right now in this generation. Besides the technology option, the cap and trade or tax options to get people off greenhouse gases, and as long as we all exhale, we're all going to be producing some. Then there's also this untouchable scientific discourse in what's called geoengineering, which I'll say is untouchable because people say, oh, well, don't do that, that's politically incorrect. But there are some fascinating studies being done now that look at major fixes that could be done. And these, you know, include, but they all involve experimenting with the Earth on a large scale in a way that makes them politically incorrect to talk about. From, you know, making the oceans slightly different in the acidity to produce more plankton to soak up more carbon, to you know, doing what volcanoes do and blocking out sunlight and reversing the recession of ice. And again, that's a scientific discourse where, you know, I think science should not be held back if it's, you know, politically incorrect. I think you should have real science discourse because maybe there are some things you could learn from that modeling. The commission hasn't recommended that yet. There have been a few workshops done by folks at NASA and others to look into this issue, but that's not being done very well right now either. I mean, if you're asking, is there a place where we don't really understand it yet, people are reluctant to get into that. And it's quite understandably, you know, that's understandably why. So if I would look hard at the technology. I wrote a paper about electric cars when I was in the 8th grade. My son is in the 10th grade and is building one now. But the technology issues are ones where I think we're exceedingly much better funded we were than when Al Gore left office. Okay? On the cap and trade and tax issues, I think we're underfunded and under-organized in the accounting and understanding what's happening in natural processes as well as the human processes. And on the geoengineering and the adaptation issues and so forth, I think there's more work to be done.
Very good. Yes, sir.
I want to ask a political question. My name is Paul Edgerton from the European Parliament. It's about exclusive economic zones and territorial delimitation in the Arctic. To what extent do you think that this would become an effective international partnerships in the future as a potential source of conflict between the Arctic rim nations? And should we be thinking about an Arctic treaty to start to regulate discussion between these nations about exclusive economic zones?
Jeff or Mead?
How about you, Jeff?
Yeah.
What I'm going to say now is based on sound silence. But no, seriously. There are a number of people in the U.S. government who are looking at those issues now and trying to understand the full extent. I know that with Canada already on one rite of passage issue that we view it from a different perspective. I don't know that we are at this point, that's to say that I don't think that we are at this point looking at an international agreement to talk about how to delineate how far out the EEZs go and what happens when two EEZs potentially conflict. There's a process that works to varying degrees of success that is run out of the State Department to handle with those sort of jurisdiction issues. Some of those problems linger for years. to my knowledge, no one is talking about an international agreement for the polar. A lot of this stuff is, you have to understand it's sinking in slowly into the policymaking process in Washington, as I'm sure it is in other capitals. So there are people thinking about those potential conflicts, but not yet proposing specific solution for something like that.
Just to kind of expand on Paul's question a little bit, you could imagine that IPY and through the Arctic Observing Network, we're going to develop kind of a consensual information framework about the Arctic that could be the basis for unified management. Do you see any move towards developing real management, circumlongitude, I guess, management for the Arctic? Because you have to do this, because if if we make polar bears an endangered species and Russia doesn't, what happens?
Well, you mean by management? I mean, are you talking about a formal international agreement or using existing structures like the Arctic Council to work out these sort of differences in approaches?
As I understand it, you'd have to expand the Arctic Council and give them actual authority rather than it being a place where people exchange information and discuss issues, that they would make decisions that would then be the cause for action. An extreme example might be SCAR in the Antarctic.
I was going to. Jeff said he wasn't sure of anybody thinking about a treaty. Let me just say that this is the first of about 5 kind of Arctic policy panels that I've been aware of that will be participating in one way or the other in the next year, where the issue of an Arctic treaty may be coming up. The Center for U.S. Studies at the University of Montreal is doing a workshop on this that several of us in the room I know will be involved in next month. The Commission is co-sponsoring a workshop with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution probably in October on many of these issues. The Aspen Institute is considering, actually at Madeleine Albright's suggestion, she's a member of the board of the Institute, is considering convening an international commission on the Arctic similar to the Pew Commission to look at some of these issues. So I think we'll probably be hearing more about this over time. On Bernie's point about polar bears, we do have the bilateral treaty with the Russians, and one of the big things that governs polar bear management right now is that if a hunter from Houston wants to go to Minnie's neighborhood to hunt a polar bear, he can't bring the pelt home unless the U.S. has kind of looked at the hunting management practices and so forth and approved them. So there's kind of an ad hoc international and national set of laws there that look at that. But one of the things that we see with the Polar Bear Treaty is a need for much more. And we're, one of our big problems, somebody asked, where are we not getting enough? We still have a big challenge of getting information out of Russia, especially where we share resources, where the fish know no boundaries, or the walrus know no boundaries, or the birds. And while we have some specific agreements, sometimes getting funding for those for implementing those agreements is tough. Just going back to the treaty issue and Paul's question, my suggestion in my talk about a shipping agreement is one that I think if you take a look, if you had a ship now that you wanted to ship through the Arctic, you can sail through the Bering Strait as an international strait. Nobody's going to tell you what you have to do. You may have insurance companies who tell you they won't insure you if you don't have certain things. But you can sail through the Bering Strait. Okay? If you happen to go within Russia's current EEZ, the Russians will ask you to hire an icebreaker, whether you need it or not, to escort you through. And even if you do hire them and you do pay the fee, the icebreaker may not show up, but you'll pay the fee and you can go or not go, as the case may be. Under the Law of the Sea Treaty, the Section 234, I think it was 234 that I mentioned, each nation in the Arctic or each nation with ice-covered waters has the right to institute new environmental regulations, which in essence could mean that in traversing the Arctic Ocean, you would be following in the Bering Strait, 2 different nations rules, and on the north of Russia or the north of Canada or the north of the United States, 3 different nations rules, and that doesn't even get you to Norway and so forth. And so that's what I call a virtual train wreck there, where you're creating this. We're actually empowering ourselves as nations right now to create these new rules. And there couldn't be a better time, in my opinion, to sit down and say, okay, what harmonized rules of shipping would, 1, make it work sensibly, so that and 2, avoid cheating, so that one person says, well, you can come here and risk polluting more. If you go through my EEZ, just pay a lower toll. And the question inside Russia as much as outside Russia, how much do you need to pay for these icebreakers has become a major issue. And when I mentioned the troll under the bridge issue, I think it's in the United States' interests, if there will be major strategic commodities going through this ocean, to make sure that there is an ecumenical, fair trading system. And so I could see, Paul, that perhaps a harmonization of shipping might be an argument for a treaty. And I mentioned the St. Lawrence Seaway issue. We have joint authorities on the St. Lawrence Seaway, and ships of many nations know that they can, go get ore from Duluth, as it were, traveling those waters, because the United States and Canada have worked out what needs to happen to be safe and open for business. And I think that could happen in the Arctic.
Could I just respond to that?
Please.
I think it's also going to be taking, it's not just from one nation's side that we have to look at this. I think that we need very strong cooperation with Russia, and to listen to the arguments that Russia puts forward also. So we may have a point where we'll need to establish a commission in order to discuss these issues, because I think it's a very important area which we should look at for the future, especially in relation to conflict, because there are a lot of conflicting interests in the Arctic resources, as you say, shipping routes, and this will become really a political issue very soon, and will also impact upon partnerships that we will develop in science in the Arctic in the future. Because we need to have very strong cooperation to build this sustained Arctic building network, but at the same time we have national interests up there which may conflict with that.
Michael?
Yeah, Michael Dorsey here at Dartmouth. Just maybe 2 questions, and particularly since we're on about guns and toting guns. Seems like one of the upshots of that could be sitting in court. I want to go back just a week ago, or I guess 2 weeks ago, on the 1st of March, Yalowitz and folks from Earth Justice and Center for International Environmental Law were down before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And I guess it dials into this question of urgency of response. They were clearly making a case that the response, particularly from folks in Evans, isn't fast enough. And I'm wondering, I guess, 2 questions. One, to what extent is there coordination going on, Minnie, on your side, within other Inuit communities on tactics and responses to move the key 8 governments forward? Because there wasn't real coherence in some of the steps that led up to that testimony that we saw 2 weeks ago. And then related to that, on the kind of government side, the U.S. government side in particular, maybe for you, Evan, what do you see kind of downstream? It's sort of curious that you mentioned this 95-0 vote. That was, as you know, in another century, and really doesn't adequately represent the reality today in the Congress. Do you see the kind of the draft bills, or at least half a dozen of them in motion? Do you see that those responses are dealing with this issue of adequate response? And also, what's your sort of, as you look downstream, you've been involved in DOS across a handful of administrations. Do you see kind of a window opening up for maybe exposure, liability exposure? People, I mean, clearly the ICC moved to bring the petition, which they didn't bring, they were just invited down to give the testimony after the petition failed, but that was a move to push this issue into the courts, to pull governments along, particularly ones that may be gun-toting, or otherwise sort of dragging their feet. A lot of concerns on some of the initiatives that you mentioned, Asia Pacific and otherwise, that those aren't enough, not moving fast enough. Do you think downstream there may be more legal responses coming out to these issues?
Please, Minnie.
I don't know if I'm the right person to answer your questions because, as you say, there's the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, as you know, as the international representative of the Inuit of the world, has taken leadership of this, the voice of the Inuit in this whole issue. But to answer your question on a more local or regional, even within Canada, I think, as I said before, we have to be the voices. We are there working with researchers. We don't have the resources within our communities. We need those research fundings. We need to be. We're the ones identifying what needs to be researched, and with that research, we're hoping to come together and do some kind of a coordination within our communities, within our region, and as well nationally, and hopefully with the assistance of ICC along with the rest of the Arctic countries. And I think I just want to go a little bit to the question of Mr. Yalowitz of are these organizations sufficient? We have, sometimes there's a saying within our communities, in our own little world of, you know, how issues just get committed out, you know? We've got committees coming out of, you know, well, yeah, okay, your ears. But I really think that, you know, some of these initiatives that have been put in place, the Arctic Council, the Northern Forum, I think, and talking about how are we going to go about, is there going to be some kind of an Arctic treaty? I think we need to take, or the countries involved need to take some kind of an inventory of what have these agencies been able to accomplish, what else is there to address, taking and just, you know, we have to, the whole world is fragile, but the Arctic is one of the most fragile in this world, and I think it's, as much as I believe that these organizations have done their part, I think the next step is to take it a step further, not to create new ones, but maybe just take it a step further and look at what have they been able to do, but what do we need to do now? And that leads to my question again, Hanu Daga, how now? You know, management, decision-making bodies. It's fine and dandy to always share what you're observing in your part of the world, but let's do something about what we shared with, you know. It's like, it's fine and dandy to share. I said we're a sharing society. It's always good to share, but if you're not going to do something with your share, what's the use of receiving it? So we don't need more committees. We don't need more organizations, but I think we need to take the organizations we have and look at where can we go with them next.
Jeff?
Just to add on to Minnie's comment about the institutional arrangements, I agree that I think that's where I know that's where we are as a government as well, is let's see what we can do with the existing structures that we have. Frankly, I think there's little appetite to set up or to empower or to give greater regulatory authority to the council. Our environmental priorities now with the Hill involve getting the law of the sea passed, PICs and POPs. There's a lot of things up there that are running into, you know, very determined and continued opposition. And rather than negotiate another agreement and send it up as part of that group, we are looking to get those passed. In terms of the legal issues, I think climate change will raise a lot of legal issues, but I don't think that there's a legal solution to this. If you could tell me how we could stop the changes that are taking place because of climate change right now as a result of a court injunction, then I would be very interested. I don't think that that is physically possible. That is that the laws of physics would allow that to happen. If you could tell me what it would take to reverse the changes that we're already committed to, I would also be interested in that, as well as what sort of economic cost that would raise. And then finally, also the question of who is liable in a world economy that's based on fossil fuels is an interesting question, and it raises intergenerational questions. You raised a lot of good intergenerational equity questions, which I, as a father, think about quite a bit. But there's the other one, who's responsible for setting up an economic structure and a society based on fossil fuels without any knowledge that, in fact, we are being led down a path that would turn out to be detrimental on the scale that we're talking about with climate change. So who are you going to sue? You're going to sue me, a climate change negotiator, or are you going to sue the guys in the 1930s, the guys in the 1920s who started off on this path? And you have to realize that there's a lot of path dependency and this is a really poor analogy, but I'm going to use it anyways. The economy is like an oil tanker. Like I said, this is a bad analogy. It takes a while to move it, and you can't move it too quickly without significant cost. So the question that we need to deal with is the one that and for the record, I didn't start the gun analogy, okay, please. That I said earlier, that is that climate change is going to happen, and the question is, how much, how soon, and what can we do to adapt to it? Those are the things. So what can we do to slow it? What can we do to avoid as much as possible, and what we can do to adapt it? But to stop it, like, as I say, in a legal proceeding is just beyond the physical possibility.
I think we've unfortunately run out of time, but I really want to thank all the panelists and the audience for your questions.